Great. Okay, so thank you so much. It's interesting because I was talking to Dennis over dinner. I was asked to speak on science and the Bible, which I'll talk about. But I've also written a book on prophecy, and I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot's been happening the last couple weeks in a very prophetic place in the world. So maybe if we do Q&A afterwards, somebody can ask me a prophecy question, and I'm more than happy to talk about what's happening in the Middle East because I am super excited about what we see right now in terms of Persia and what it means for Christianity in the region. Before we begin, let me just say, I see a couple people brought notebooks. I'm going to hand around an email sign-up list. If you give me your email, I will send you a transcript from today, so you'll have that in email. And I'm also going to send an electronic version of the book. Somebody brought my book. Thank you so much. And I'll send you an electronic version of it, but only if I can read your email, because most people don't write very clearly. So you can circulate that, and if you want those, just let me know. So I'm here to talk about science and Christianity. And why does that matter? It matters because all of us now, as I'm sure this group knows especially, faith is being challenged, especially in this state. We've been under attack for a very long time, and something happened about 150 years ago that changed the world. And now Christianity is viewed as the antithesis of science. You have science on one side, you have Christianity on the other. The two don't meet anywhere in the middle. The question we're going to ask tonight is that the view that we should have? Does that make sense? And the argument I'm going to make is very simple, and that is, if you go back in time, the greatest scientists of all time, Newton, Kepler, Copernicus, Pascal, Boyle, these scientists all viewed their craft as trying to discover more about God. Newton wrote a book on prophecy, which he was more proud of than discovering the meaning of gravity. He wrote more Christian books than he wrote secular books, even though he goes down in history as one of the most famous scientists. So anyway, that really matters. And also because, as I think most of you know, Charles Darwin wrote his book on the origin of species and came up with a theory of evolution about 150 years ago. And folks like Richard Dawkins have now used that to make a case for removing Christianity from education, removing it from science, removing it from everywhere else. In fact, Richard Dawkins is very famous for saying, evolution allowed me to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. And that's really what's happened, is evolution for the first time created basically an explanation for the origin of species and biology and everything you see independent of a God. Because up until that point, the vast majority of people in the world believed in God. That changed about 150 years ago. But what's exciting and what we're going to talk about tonight is over the last couple dozen years, the scientific case has completely shifted back to God. Most people have no idea, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And I want to start with, in the beginning, for obvious reasons. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I think everyone's familiar with this verse. It's probably one of the most popular verses in the Bible. In the beginning, God. At the root of our faith is God is responsible for the creation of the universe. God is responsible for the entire story. And God's responsible for the Bible. Probably one of the most important Bible verses, because if it's true that God created the universe, everything else in that book is believable. Parting the Red Sea? That's a joke compared to creating the universe. Raising someone from the dead? Kind of irrelevant, right? Easy. Every miracle that you see in the Bible, multiplying fish and loaves, for a God who created the entire universe out of the word of his mouth? Trivialities. The question is, did God create the universe? And is there any evidence for it? That's the important thing. And I don't think what most people recognize is very recently, we're going to go through tonight 4 arguments for the existence of God and 4 scientific discoveries that talk about what we know about God and the universe. And the first is the Big Bang. And I want to start with the Big Bang because most Christians, if I say the Big Bang, Most Christians react very negatively to that. No, I believe in God. I don't believe in the Big Bang. But I want to make a very interesting case, because the Big Bang really proves the Christian argument. The Big Bang was this event where everything you know got created. There were no atoms, there were no molecules, there was no matter, there was no energy, there was absolutely nothingness. And what happened is, we now know, if I go to a quote from Bill Bryson, everything was created, and most scientists will agree with this. In fact, almost all scientists agree. In 3 minutes, 98% of all the matter that is or ever will be or ever has been produced, we have a universe. It's a place of the most wondrous and gratifying possibility, and beautiful too. And it was all done in the time it takes to make a sandwich. Now, I want you to understand the magnitude of this. If we go back in time, philosophers from the days of Plato and Aristotle argued forever, was the universe always here or was it created? This has been a raging debate for like literally 7,000 years. The recorded history, people pondering the nature of the universe. We never had an answer to that question. It was a great philosophical question. People debated it. There were tomes and tomes of books written about it, but we never knew the answer to it. Up until 35 years ago. 35 years ago, it was definitively proved that the universe that we live in is expanding, which means it had a beginning. Now, I want to explain this a little bit. So, the universe, let's go back to about 1919. A guy by the name of Edwin Hubble, who you probably know the name, they named a telescope after him. Edwin Hubble was an astronomer looking through his telescope, looking at shifts in color lights, and basically made a theory that others had postulated, but basically, for the first time, had some evidence that the universe was expanding. The implication of this is profound, because if the universe is expanding over time, getting bigger and bigger and bigger, I can rewind in time, and at some point in the beginning, that universe was created. And that's what we refer to as the Big Bang, meaning the universe, which includes not just all the material things in the universe, but time, energy, space, and matter were all created at that event. So in the beginning, God creates the heaven and the earth. That would be my argument. That's the biblical argument. Any scientist today worth their salt is going to agree with the statement that at the Big Bang, time, energy, space, and matter were created. Do you understand that parallels the biblical account? In the beginning, time, God created. He used energy. What did he do? He created the heavens and the earth, space and matter. So in the beginning, God creates the heaven and the earth. He creates time, energy, space, and matter, and we have a universe. Albert Einstein, no dummy, was confronted by this fact. When he was developing his theory of relativity, he realized that his equation did not permit the universe to be static, meaning not expanding. He didn't like that idea because he believed as an atheist that there wasn't a God. So he fudged his mathematical equation in the theory of relativity to keep the universe static. And then about 10 years later, Edwin Hubble confronted him, showed him absolute proof, going through, or at least evidence, I should say, of the universe expanding. And Einstein later had to revise his formula and admitted it was the biggest mistake of his life. Because he took his theological presupposition and built his formulas of science around that. And he failed. But it wasn't until 1990 when we put up what's called the Cosmic Background Explorer, a satellite in orbit to measure background radiation, that we definitively proved the universe had a beginning. And if the universe had a beginning, then the universe had a beginner. Doesn't mean it's a Christian God, but it means something capable of creating time, energy, space, and matter in 3 minutes. Think about that. Atheists have no explanation for the Big Bang. Christians do. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But what other cause can create time, energy, space, and matter in a span of about 3 minutes? So when we say the Big Bang, Christians, this is one of the most exciting developments that we've ever seen, because it definitively proves there was a beginning, and as a result, there was a beginner. So that's evidence number one, Big Bang. Evidence number two, recent discoveries that support God, is what's called fine-tuning. Fine-tuning is this weird principle that's been recently discovered, and I'll quote from a physicist named Brandon Carter. He says, all the seemingly arbitrary and unrelated constants of physics have one strange thing in common. They are precisely the values you need if you want to have a universe capable of producing life. This is a fairly recent discovery, because even about 24 years ago, you could make a case that said, we're here in the universe kind of by accident. We just got here, we were lucky, the universe happened, life developed out of a primordial pool or something like that, and then, boom, we got lucky. That's no longer the case. Now scientists are grappling with this fact that the universe is incredibly well designed. Absolutely mind-boggling designed. So, okay, you gonna hold up your phone here for a second? Just hold it up for a second. Okay. If I find this in the parking lot on my way home tonight, what do you conclude? That, oh, it's amazing. The trees and the leaves kind of fell leaves and all of a sudden this was created accidentally? Or do you say that's something that was made through an intelligence? Of course everyone's going to say it was made through an intelligence, but the more interesting question is why? How do you know that phone is created by an intelligence and just didn't happen by chance? And the argument is going to be, well, it looks designed. It's got very precision, corners. They're all symmetrical. It's got function. I can turn it on and send an email. It's got purpose. There's a whole bunch of things we recognize as having design. So I know that the phone was created by an intelligence as opposed to just happening by accident. So when we say fine-tuning, this is what we're referring to. Absolutely mind-boggling, finely tuned universe. And our minds can't really comprehend how precisely this universe is tuned. But I want to give you an analogy. Let's say Elon Musk is successful. He shoots a rocket up to Mars, okay? Lands on Mars. Somebody gets out of that spaceship, looks around, and there's a house. And he walks into the house, and he realizes there's oxygen in this house. The oxygen level is set perfectly. He takes off his helmet. He realizes the temperature is perfectly set at 70 degrees. He recognizes that, there's a couch and a chair, which are kind of like perfectly sized for, normal-sized human being. And he goes to a panel in the house, and the panel is basically the oxygen level and the humidity level and the temperature and all these other things that make it habitable. If that were to happen, what would we conclude? The headline in the paper the next day would be, proof of life discovered on Mars. Either that or the Russians got there first. But nobody would conclude that that got there by accident. And that's what we're talking about. And I just want to give you a couple examples of this. These are just some of the finely tuned parameters in the universe. There's about 36 of these, and each year another 1 or 2 get discovered. And again, these are a little geeky, but let's just take a couple of them. The strong nuclear force. So it's tuned within 1 in 1,000. So what does that mean? It means, think of a dial, and it has 1,000 possible settings on it. If it's 1 click off, there's no universe. There's no hydrogen in the universe, or the universe is entirely all hydrogen. So 1,000 settings, it just happens to be set on the 1 perfect value. Let's take the next one, the electromagnetic force within 10 to the 40th. If that is 1 number off, there is no universe. There are no molecules in the universe. Now, 10 to the 40th, for those of you who don't remember your high school math class, is 10 quadrillion. So this dial has 10 quadrillion possibilities on it. 1 click off, no universe. The next one, the weak nuclear force, 714 different possibilities on that dial, perfectly set. The gravitational force, 10 to the 27th. The expansion rate of the universe, 10 to the 55th. These are mind-boggling big numbers. So 35 dials, all set within, some cases, thousands, some cases, quadrillion possible values, and they're perfectly set for life. What do you conclude? We just got lucky. There are more possible settings for these dials than there are atoms in this universe. We didn't get lucky. Somebody knew we were coming. Somebody designed this universe in a way very specifically for the existence of life. That's fine-tuning. So if a beginning implies a beginner, Big Bang requires something to create it, now a design implies a designer. We've observed immaculate design in the universe that requires a designer. So let's talk about evolution, number 3. I think most folks remember probably school the story goes something like this. In the beginning, there was a bunch of chemicals that kind of coalesced into a planet. There was a primordial pool of chemicals. Lightning hit it, and then all of a sudden we got our first cell. And our first cell multiplied, and over time, billions and billions and billions of years, we end up with mankind. Okay, that's the story I was taught when I was in elementary school. We now know that that is 100% demonstrably wrong. It could not have happened that way. And I want to walk through 4 reasons we know that that is wrong. Because again, we're still teaching our kids this stuff. And this is kind of the sad state of affairs in our country. So before I begin though, when I say evolution, I want to be very careful because I think folks get tripped up on this. When I say evolution, I'm referring to one species turning into another species. This is called macroevolution. It's different than microevolution. Microevolution is one species changing over time. So, if any of you have been on a trip in Europe and you tour some of the castles, you may notice that humans were a lot shorter even 200 years ago than they are today. Mankind has gotten taller. Now, you could argue it's nutrition, but at the end of the day, species do change over time, we know that. But what we know now is one species cannot change into another species. Charles Darwin, when he wrote his book on the origin of species, titled it The Origin of Species because he was trying to explain how all the species got here. And that's where he came up with this idea of evolution. But again, we now know that that didn't happen that way. And again, I'm going to give you 5 reasons that we know it didn't happen that way. Number 1, macroevolution has never been observed. In the scientific world, to have a theory, you need observation, you need evidence, you need testing, and you need validation. This is kind of the scientific method. The problem with evolution is it's never been observed. There's never been one case of one species turning into another species. And now we know because we understand genetics, we understand cellular biology, we understand DNA. We understand that no matter how hard we try, we cannot turn one species into another species. And scientists have tried really hard. They've taken everything from bacteria to fruit flies, which have a very short, what's called gestation period, meaning how fast they can replicate and have kids and how fast bacteria can split. And they can simulate millions and millions and millions of years of evolution. And they do that by bombarding the fruit flies or the bacteria with radiation. So they're simulating, trying to provoke mutation that then is going to turn it into another species. Never once have we ever been able to turn one species into another species. And again, we'll keep down the list, you'll understand why. Number 2, mutations. Mutations are one of the central enablers of evolution. The idea is, you have a monkey, he gets a mutation, all of a sudden he has intelligence, and over time, that evolves into a human. The problem with that is we've done tons and tons of work in the scientific community to try and understand mutation. 2 problems. Problem number 1, mutation is almost always detrimental to the organism. For instance, Down syndrome is a genetic mutation. It's almost always detrimental. Most genetic problems result in either sterilization or death at an early age or birth defects. The second problem with mutation is it doesn't add genetic material, and this is really the killer. I would love to be able to have wings, okay? But in order to have wings, I need more genetic material in my DNA. I can't just mutate my existing DNA and grow wings. And that's the problem. We now understand DNA, we now understand how the cell works, and we know just mutating, I can change your hair color through a mutation, I can change your eye color through a mutation, but I can't give you new capabilities you didn't have before. I can't take a fruit fly and mutate it and turn it into a bird. It will never happen. So that's problem number 2 in terms of mutations. In fact, here's a quote from a biophysicist. Among all the mutations that have been studied, there aren't any known clear examples that have added information. Again, this is the problem. If I'm trying to get from a single cell to a human, mutations don't do it. You need new genetic information. And the reason is pretty obvious. When Charles Darwin was looking through his microscope, he didn't have a very powerful microscope, and he thought that a cell was pretty simple. We now know the cell is incredibly complex. There are over 10 billion molecules that make up a cell, and the cell itself does everything from bring in nutrients, dispose of waste, replicate itself, store information. There's a whole bunch of functions. It's a miniature factory in terms of how it works. And we now know way too complicated for that to have happened by chance. All these parts have to come together for you to have one cell. And again, you can't mutate it to get anything new. So problem number 2 is basically the complexity of the cell and mutations. The third problem is natural selection. Natural selection is this idea of survival of the fittest. Meaning, if I have a mutation, that's going to allow me to basically survive better than you. So at the end of the day, I'm going to, my species, I'm going to mate, it's going to have kids, and I'll advance the human species this way. The problem with natural selection, though, is it only works with existing information. It doesn't add information. Again, we're sort of back to this fundamental problem of natural selection not adding new types of information. It also doesn't occur unless that organism can reproduce. So, without sort of getting too complicated, you have to start with a living cell, a living being, for natural selection to even work. It doesn't explain the origin of life. It doesn't explain the origin of species. And that's problem number 3. Problem number 4 that has been kind of very interesting is the fossil record. Charles Darwin, when he wrote his book, he knew that this was a problem at the time, but he thought that more fossils would be discovered over time that validated his theory. And he said this in his book. This is from The Origin of Species. The most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory is the fossil record. Why, if every species have descended from other species by insensibly fine gradations, do we not see everywhere innumerable transitional forms? So let me unpack that because it's a bunch of science speak. What this means is this. She's nodding her head. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so if Darwin's theory is correct, we would have started with a single cell, and then over a very long period of time, billions and billions and billions of years, that would gradually evolve into something more complicated. So what you expect to see is that cell, maybe over millions of years, turn into a sea cucumber, over millions of years turn into a tadpole, over millions of years turn into a reptile, over millions of years walk out of the ocean, turn into a beaver or whatever, and then eventually turn into a monkey, and then eventually into a human. That's Darwin's theory. Okay? The problem with the fossil record is it doesn't support this at all. Because according to the theory of evolution, you shouldn't have monkeys and humans in the fossil record. You should have monkeys, and then something that's 99% monkey and 1% human, and then something that's 98% monkey and 2% human, and these fine little gradations over time. The problem is, 150 years after Darwin, there are no transitional forms. None. There have been about a dozen proposed over the years that have amounted to either blatant forgeries or purposeful misdirection, meaning I found a monkey skull cap here, and then 50 yards away, 10 feet deeper in the fossil record, I found a human bone. And I assume they went together, and that's an example. So there is not one fossil today that represents an intermediate form between two species. Worse than that, you would expect to find millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of these things. We haven't found one yet. Argues very strongly against Darwin's theory of evolution. And then finally, the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion is essentially a big bang in the fossil record. What does that mean? It means that all of the major species and body plans show up at the same time in the fossil record, geologically speaking. So if you were to take the entire history of the Earth and put it on a 24-hour clock, all the species show up within 1 minute of each other. Totally the opposite of what you would expect from evolution. You would expect, again, very simple organisms, billions of years later, a little bit more complex, billions of years later, something more complex, etc. It's not what you find. What you find is every body plan, what I mean by that is reptiles, birds, etc., etc. Almost all the species all show up at the same time. Let me quote from a famous paleontologist. The Cambrian explosion is a global event in which very suddenly, at about the same time, the horizon, the world over, life shows up in the rocks with a bang. Everything just shows up roughly around the same time, geologically speaking. Totally the opposite of what you would expect from evolution. And then finally, problem number 5 is DNA. The Cambrian explosion in the fossil record doesn't support, obviously Darwin's argument. But we also know now that DNA is the fundamental reason that evolution is fatally flawed. What do I mean by that? DNA is this thing that was discovered in the 1950s that basically controls the instruction set of your cells. So if you're trying to build a human, you're trying to build a bird, you're trying to build a reptile, you need to have the instruction set. You know, when I was young, I worked at an engine plant at the Ford Motor Company in Detroit. And it wasn't enough to have metal coming in the door and a bunch of machines set up on the assembly lines. You needed what was called the process manual. You needed to have this manual that said, okay, the metal comes in, you stamp it with a big stamping press. And then you hand it to the next guy, and he drills a hole in 2 different places. That's exactly a certain width. And then it goes down and on and on. So these instruction manuals were absolutely critical in terms of building an engine that worked at the end of the day. Your DNA is the same function. If any of you kind of are tech people, it's the same thing as computer code. In fact, the more we've studied DNA, the more we know it's computer code. It has procedures, it has functions, it basically has recursion. So everything we would know as part of computer programming is true in the cell. So the question is, where did all that instruction come from? And I want to put this a little bit in perspective. Bill Gates said DNA is a software program, only much more complex than anything that we've devised. Now I want you to think about that. He's right. DNA is a computer program. It is more complex than anything Microsoft has ever written. Microsoft Windows has about 16 million lines of code. One cell in your body has about 60 times that number of lines of code. Microsoft has, last count, about 300,000 programmers. Let's say there's 100,000 of those working on Windows. 100,000 programmers working for 20 years to build Windows 11. One cell has more than 60 times the amount of code in it than all of Windows. Who wrote the code? What intelligence is there that could produce that code? And by the way, you have 1 trillion cells in your body, I will point out. This is the very fundamental question of life. Who wrote the computer code? Because there's a fundamental tenet of information theory that says information only comes from intelligent beings. If I were to find a book right there, you read it, it didn't happen by accident. It wasn't monkeys typing at a typewriter that created that book. It took some intelligence to create it. I don't care how many Scrabble sets you have, if you throw them all onto the floor, you're never going to come out with War and Peace. That's not how this works mathematically. right? Microsoft, if any of you kind of know programming, one mistake causes a bug that can be catastrophic to that operating system. You got to get every line of code perfectly right. And that's what you see in DNA. So how did that computer code show up? And I want to quote from another geophysicist who said this: "Do coded algorithms which are a million words in length arise spontaneously by any known process? Is there anything in the laws of physics that suggest how such structures might arise in a spontaneous fashion?" The honest answer is simple. What we presently understand from information theory argues that they do not and they cannot. Meaning information always comes from an intelligence. So the $64,000 question is this: if there's computer code in every cell that's 60 times more complicated than anything Microsoft has ever written, and it comes from an intelligence, where did it come from? Richard Dawkins, the very famous atheist, if any of you saw the movie Expelled, at the end of it, he's confronted with this question. He says, well, it probably came from aliens or something like that, and just kind of wrote it off. It came from aliens? Well, where did they get it from? You see the problem here? It doesn't answer the question. We now know that God showed us his intelligence in DNA in every single cell in your body. This isn't theoretical anymore. This is why evolution failed, and it's why we now know that evolution wasn't how we got here. So, the universe had a beginning, which means there was a beginner, something capable of creating time, energy, space, and matter. The universe has incredibly, unbelievably amazing design, mathematically completely improbable. Not just improbable, impossible. Had to have a designer. We know that evolution didn't explain how we got here. Fundamentally flawed in terms of a variety of different ways. And we also know DNA proves that there's some intelligence that created your DNA. This is why we live in exciting times, is because the scientific case over the last 20, 30 years have all pointed back to God. Charles Darwin pointed people over here. I think God has a sense of humor. God's like, no, I want to be known. Okay, so why does this matter, right? Okay, fine. This is a fun topic for a class. I'm not in high school anymore. Why do I matter? It matters especially for a group like this because of what William Provine wrote. William Provine is a very famous atheist at Cornell University. And he said, here's the implications of Darwinism. If Darwinism is true, there's no God. There's no evidence for a God. Meaning we got here by accident. Mutation, natural selection, no need for a God. Okay? This is why so many people are rejecting God these days. We send them off to college. We teach them, no, God was involved in creating it. You must be kidding. And then we wonder why our kids are walking away from belief in Christianity. There's no life after death is the second consequence. Well, it makes sense. If the earth just got here accidentally and we're just byproducts of accidents, then there's no life after death. There's nothing to live for. There's no absolute right and wrong. There's no foundation for right and wrong. You're probably like me and you get horrified when you see these video clips on the internet of kids. They walk into an Apple store and they just rip off every phone and they just walk out. It's like they have no moral foundation. If I believe there's no God and it's survival of the fittest, then why shouldn't I steal your phone? Survival of the fittest, man. It's up to, there is no God. There's no right and wrong. It's all up to, like you said, we're all accidents. We're all trying to survive. There's no ultimate meaning for life. Arthur Brooks has a book coming out in the next couple of months. Arthur Brooks is a famous writer at Harvard University. And he basically looks at the epidemic of children that are causing self-harm. So suicides, drug overdoses, things like that. And it is skyrocketing just over the last 10, 15 years. I don't know how many people realize this. And he traces all the signs basically back to one thing, and that is people feel there's a lack of meaning in their lives. Well, sure, if I tell my kids, you're an accident, you're a mutation, you're just here by chance, of course there's no meaning in their lives. So there's no meaning, and that's leading to consequences in society. And then ultimately people don't have free will. Because, again, if I'm accidents, I'm chemical reactions, there's no soul, there's no eternity, there's no absolute truth, there's no lawgiver, then there's no free will. So this is the world we live in. My takeaway for you is this, right? Number one, I want folks to realize science done right points to God. One of my friends, Stephen Meyer, who writes in this field a lot, basically makes this argument that if we do science right, it points to God. And this is what we're seeing. Despite science's best effort, God wants to be known. And this is what these recent scientific discoveries show. The second is we should be encouraging kids to pursue the sciences. I think many ways Christians have kind of turned away from that to some degree because it's, like I said, people continually argue, obviously, they go to science and lose their faith because they're kind of confronted with the fact that, we don't need a God anymore. I encourage kids to pursue the sciences and understand the real arguments behind this. And then finally, at the end of the day, I think we need to recognize what an awesome God we have. It all goes back to this, in the beginning, God. In the beginning, God. That is so important to our faith. God created the universe. God created us. God gives us a moral law. God gives us meaning. All of this comes from God, and it all comes from that first verse in the chapter of Genesis. And this is why God starts with the creation account, because it's so important that we understand that. So let me end there, but hopefully I've given you a little bit of glimpse of how awesome our God is and what a sense of humor he has. Because as soon as we think we've got it figured out as humans, God sort of points back and says, no, without me, you guys don't understand anything. So let me stop there and I'll just open it up for questions about anything. Yes. Oh, okay. Well, let's start here. Ladies first. Oh, okay, yeah.
A little thing about Iran.
Little thing about Iran. Yeah. Okay, so I could go on for hours about what's happening in the Middle East, but the most fascinating thing I think is this. Where did Christianity start? Over there, Israel, right? Where did it go from there? It moved west to Rome. Rome became the center of the Christian empire, or the Christian world, I should say, in about 300 AD. Constantine, the Roman emperor, basically made Christianity the state religion of Rome. We went from being persecuted to 300 years later, it was the state religion of Rome, which is why, by the way, the Catholic Church is headquartered in Rome. Okay, so it moved from Israel to Rome. Where did it go after that? Well, the papacy actually moved to France at one point, and France and Britain became the two largest countries sending out missionaries. Britain had a huge impact. In fact, Charles Darwin's voyage to the Galapagos Islands was on a missionary journey. Most people don't realize this. He started out going there as a missionary with the captain and wrote a book defending missionary work amongst the South Africans. So anyway, where did it go from there? It went to the United States. In the last century, the United States sent out far more missionaries than any other place in the world. Christianity through TV ministries, through Billy Graham, through a bunch of other things, publishing. Center of the Christian world was the United States in the 1900s. Who's sending out the most Christians now? You can actually just look at the map over here. Just keep going west. China, Korea, the Asian countries now send out far more Christians than we do here in the United States. There are more Christians right now in communist China than there are in the entire United States. I went to Korea a while ago and ended up going to a church on Sunday because I was there for the weekend. The pastor got up. There's 10,000 people in this church. It blew my mind. 10,000 people in a Korean church. They escort me over to a section that had 12 buttons. French, German, English. You click your button and put on a headset and it's translated in your language. And at the end, they got on their knees and they commissioned a preacher to go to preach to the unsaved in Seattle, Washington. It's like, that was just such an eye-opener about what's going on in Asia. Okay, what's been happening in the last 10 years? If you follow missionary organizations that are operating in the Middle East, in specifically Muslim countries, Iran, Saudi Arabia, there's this amazing thing happening in the last 10, 15 years where people are having dreams of Jesus Christ. And people have been coming to Christianity in unprecedented ways in that region of the world. You have now over 1 million Christians in Iran. And what I believe is happening from a prophetic point of view, and I could point to a bunch of different verses, but Christianity started in Israel, it wrapped around the world, and then it comes right back. And right now we're on the doorstep of Iran. I believe God's going to open up a door in Iran for Christianity to spread like wildfire across that region of the world. And even Saudi Arabia, Dubai, the Emirates, you look at the other countries, Hezbollah, Hamas, gone out of basically Egypt, Gaza, Syria, Lebanon, etc. Right? So you have this unprecedented opportunity for Christianity to spread, which is interesting because the Bible says the gospel will be spread to the whole world. And then the most important punctuation in the entire Bible, comma, and then the end will come. We've seen the Bible go around the entire globe, and the Bible now has reached the whole world, or soon will be, if Iran opens up. Again, a million things could happen over the next couple weeks. It's too early to tell. But man, I think God's doing something over there. And if you look at some of the video images that came out on Sunday where Iranians were worshiping Christ openly in Tehran, blew my mind. So yeah, God's opening up the door for his name to be known. Yes, sir?
Just to add on to what she asked, why, I think I already know the answer to this, but why do so few churches talk about prophecy? You see that as a problem? I think I already know the answer.
So yes, I think, well, so first of all, let's be clear. I mean, what's happened? For 2,000 years, Israel was wiped off the face of the globe, okay? There's been no country in the entire world that got wiped off the face of the globe and then came back 2,000 years later. Like if I were to tell you, hey, the Mayans and the Aztecs, they're making a comeback. You'd be like, you're an idiot, right? Israel disappeared for 2,000 years. So what happened in Christian theology? You start with, the Middle-Age philosophers like, Augustine and others. There's no Israel. So then we don't understand how to interpret these prophecies. Oh, the church must be the new Israel. The church inherited the promises of Israel. We're the continuation of Israel. That's how God's going to fulfill all these promises that God gives us in the end times. There's no literal revelation. There's no literal tribulation. Those all either happened in the first century or they'll happen at some point in the future. But you basically had to come up with explanations for prophecy without an Israel because there was none. And then, of course, Israel became a nation again in 1948. And what happened? Folks like Hal Lindsey and others started writing and saying, hello, what if we interpret these things literally again? And that opened up a whole new sort of era of, whether it's authors, theologians, sort of relooking at all the prophecies and realizing, Israel is a real country again. Ezekiel chapter 4 and 6 talk very specifically about a timeline for when Israel would become a country again. And I don't know how many of you know this. I've written a paper on it. Send me an email, I'll shoot you a paper. The timeline that Ezekiel gives, written 3,000 years ago, of when Israel would become a nation again, was fulfilled to the exact day on May 14th, 1948. In fact, the Prime Minister of Israel got up in front of the parliament and basically read that prophecy and said that prophecy is fulfilled today. Now, people would say, well, okay, scheming Jews, they planned that. Except, why did the Jews become a nation in 1948? It's because they were persecuted in World War II. Nobody wanted to deal with these refugees. It was a refugee crisis. And everyone's like, we don't want to give back their houses and their money. Why don't we just ship them all off to Palestine? They can make a home there, right? So the Jews had no ability to pick that date. It was entirely picked by the United Nations, and who basically authorized them to go back there and give them that land. In fulfillment of prophecy, unbeknownst to the United Nations, of course. So anyway, that's, to me, what's fascinating about it, and that's what caused everybody to rethink prophecy, and where you had everyone now sort of saying, okay, well, if Israel's real again, then all these other prophecies are probably real as well, including the prophecies related to Babylon, Iraq, including the ones related to Elam, which is Iran and Persia. These prophecies that were left unfulfilled in the Old Testament, well, maybe God has a fulfillment plan because he's already done it with Israel. So that's what I think is happening. And that's why I think so many people miss it. But why so many churches are afraid to talk about it is because I think there's just so much confusion. Like there's so many different views and so many different interpretations. Most pastors would rather avoid it. And I'll be honest, most seminaries don't teach it. It is very sad. Yes?
So there's scripture that explains science, right? In different books of the Bible.
Yeah, there's about, in the book that I'll send you if I have your email, there's a chapter which kind of goes through all the verses that talk about science. And what's fascinating is it talks about things that weren't known until 2,000 years later. It talks about, well, I mean, everyone says, ooh, the Bible says the earth is flat. Well, that doesn't say that. It actually says the earth is round. David says that in the book of Psalms, right? So things like that. It talks about the currents in the ocean. Nobody knew about things like the currents in the ocean and the Gulf Stream and things like that. But in hindsight, you can read the verses and you're like, yeah, that's of course what they're talking about. So yeah, it's very fascinating because God, of course, knows how the world works. He planted a bunch of seeds in these Old Testament writers that we see this stuff show up, even though it wasn't known to the people at the time. Where again, I think God has a sense of humor because he said, well, I knew this stuff 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago. You're just figuring it out now. People thought the Bible was crazy, but it turns out it was magical. And I think that's what we see. Yes, sir.
What about, you see recent events in the last couple of years, starting with October 7th? How do you see that parallel with Ezekiel 38, 39, Gog and Magog?
Yeah, so that is a fantastic question. So the question was, October 7th in Israel, where they were attacked, how does that relate to the prophecies given in Ezekiel 38, 39? So there's a set of prophecies that talk about Israel being attacked and supernaturally repelling the enemies, and that leading to mass belief in basically God. I don't see that as a direct fulfillment of Ezekiel 38, 39. And the reason is, if you go through the details of the attack that's described, it's a whole bunch of nations coming against Israel. It's not just the Gaza Strip. You could argue Iran's in there, etc. But it also talks about, as you know, most people interpret Gog and Magog referring to Russia and a bunch of other countries, right? So I don't think when you look at Ezekiel 38, 39, you can say that that was October 7th, if for no other reason than the result of that attack leads to a lot of people in Israel become Christians, which certainly wasn't the case. So I think we're still waiting to see that attack. Yes.
Pastor Jack Kidd has preached on Jeremiah 49 and Persia being part of that potential prophecy being fulfilled. What's going on?
That I was studying that this week. And I think there's a good case to be saying that that's what we're seeing fulfilled in our day. I need to do a lot more study, but there's no doubt that, God is setting the chess pieces on the board in such a way that it's super compelling. Israel becomes a nation again. Remember, Ezekiel saw the valley of dry bones, and what happened? The bones came to life, but they were not humans again. This is a metaphor for Israel becoming a nation again. In fact, it actually says this. Israel becoming a nation again and not being spiritually fulfilled until later. And it talks about them growing, tendons and muscles and things like that. So, this happens in stages, but no question Israel becomes a nation first in a secular nation, unbelief. And then through a series of events that we see in prophecy, at the end of the day, it's about Israel coming back to faith in the Father. And most people don't realize prophecy is not about you. Everyone asks me about where's America in prophecy. It's not about you. It's the story of Israel. This is the story of the prodigal son. The prodigal son took his inheritance, squandered it, came back in the end times, which is what we're going to see, begging for the Father to accept him again. And that Father's going to welcome him with open arms. But there's another brother in the story. That brother never left, and he was loyal. That's the church. That's the story of prophecy. It's the story of that prodigal son coming back to the Father. We're just the happy bystanders. Yes, ma'am.
A book at home called The Signatures in the Cell.
Yep.
It's about 30 years old.
Yep.
Nobody's ever heard of it. What have you, and what is your opinion of it?
So Signature in the Cell is written by a good friend of mine named Stephen Meyer. He's written 3 books since then. Signature. So for those of you who don't know, it's a book basically about DNA and the case for God's proof that basically DNA is written by an intelligence source. It's very heavy. It's written towards scientists. So if you have it on your shelf and you've read the whole thing, I commend you. It's not a light read. He's written written one very recently. If I was going to recommend a Stephen Meyer book, he's written one called The Return of the God Hypothesis, which is a summary of a lot of what I talked about tonight. And that's a very good book, and it's written toward the average person. But yeah, I love Stephen Meyer. He's the head of the global intelligent design movement. There are, I don't know how many of you know, but there's hundreds at this point of scientists that are now researching intelligent design. These scientific cases for Christianity. They're all over the world. They're in Brazil, they're in Germany, they're in China. The Discovery Institute, which is here in Seattle, coordinates the work of all of them and funds a lot of it. So Stephen Meyer leads that program, and he's a local guy.
What I wondered was, because I'm into evangelism and I like distributing, little booklets.
Yep.
I was wondering, did anyone ever write a short synopsis of the signatures in the cell? Like maybe 40 or 50 pages?
Yeah, so there are some, there's a whole bunch of materials targeted at different age groups. If I was going to recommend one resource written toward a normal non-scientist person, an adult, it would be Lee Strobel's A Case for a Creator. He did a fantastic job in that book, writing it in a way that's non-scientific, that does a very good job recommending it. Okay, I'm running way over.
Is that the movie equivalent, The Case for Christ?
Case for Christ is a different book that makes kind of his story about faith and why Jesus is the Messiah. A Case for a Creator is about why we know there's a God. So I'll just end here. If you have questions, email me, please. And like I said, if I get your email, I'll send you the Apologetics book, which has all the scientific stuff in it. Okay, thank you.